I'm Robert Lang. I'm director of Brookings Mountain West, and I'm happy to introduce Cliff Gaddy, who's an expert in all things Russia. In fact, he has a new book out he wants to promote, Mr. Putin, Operative in the Kremlin. Sounds intriguing. Tonight he's going to speak on the middle class versus the creative class, the fight for Russia's future. And I don't want to take up any more of his time. I'll let him do most of his introductions about his background. I find it best to let the speakers highlight those points they think are the most relevant to the talk and to the audience. So with that, Cliff, you want to come up?
I certainly do.
All right.
Thank you, Rob. It's nice to be back at UNLV. I was here a couple of years ago and gave a lecture in this very same room, and I'm sure some of you might have been here then. That time I gave a presentation with a bunch of PowerPoint slides because I'm an economist and we just can't talk without PowerPoint slides. But I have weaned myself from PowerPoint. I'm not going to use any slides tonight. Yes, I'm going to talk about Russia's middle class and the concept of a creative class. I'm really going to talk about, however, Vladimir Putin, and I'm glad that Rob mentioned this new book that I've written together with a colleague of mine at Brookings, Fiona Hill. In fact, this concept of the creative class versus the middle class and Putin's version of the middle class is very much the climax, if you like, at least the conclusion of our book about who Putin is, how he came to be who he is, what he wants to do, and how he's dealing with Russian society at this current point. Yesterday, Putin was he's been taking a tour of Western Europe. He was in Germany, and yesterday he was in the Netherlands. And after meeting with the Dutch Prime Minister, Mr. Rutte, they held a joint press conference. The first question after their introductory remarks was by a Dutch journalist who said, before we start with anything about Russian-Dutch relations, you know, of course, that Margaret Thatcher just died. And I wonder if the two of you could make comments about your view of her contributions to Europe and the concept of Europe and to European security. That's what he actually was asking about Thatcher and Europe. Putin immediately answered, but he didn't say a word about Thatcher and Europe. He said the following. He said, Margaret Thatcher was probably one of the most outstanding political figures of the 20th century. He dropped the name, said, I met her a couple times. She made a big impression on me. He said, what I think is distinctive about Margaret Thatcher is that she was a woman who was a leader who was pragmatic, consistent, and he used a word sometimes translated as tough. It means more than that. It means harsh. It's жесткий. It actually can mean ruthless. And if it comes from a Russian, you know it means pretty harsh. This is a word used about Putin. It's a word used about Stalin. So this is what he said. Thatcher was pragmatic, consistent, and жесткий. Putin went on to say that it was exactly those features of her character that allowed her to lead Britain out of crisis, out of economic crisis, in a critical period. Her measures weren't popular, he said. She was criticized for her austerity policies. She was criticized for restricting trade union rights, trampling on trade union rights. But, says Putin, those were the right things to do in a crisis. And she was definitely in a crisis. And, he added, her measures worked. He used another favorite word of his. They were effective, effectively. And finally, he concluded by, and I think people should thank her for that. He didn't, by the way, say the British people. He just said people. It was as if he were talking about himself, and of course that's my point. It's as if we, or those who listened, we're listening to Putin giving an elegy about himself. Because Putin certainly does see himself as the savior of a nation in crisis. He sees himself as unfairly criticized for taking measures that were absolutely necessary in a crisis. And he too hopes that history will vindicate him, that someday people will be mourning the great political figure Vladimir Putin, who did what was necessary under tough conditions. Now, there are, of course, all kinds of ways in which a parallel between Putin and Thatcher simply falls short, I think probably even in Putin's eyes. In fact, Putin has never yet tried to push through harsh austerity measures. In fact, it's just the opposite. He is engaged in a lot of populist spending. It is true that he has managed to balance his budget better than any leader, perhaps anywhere in the world, over the past 10 years. But right now he's spending more on populist measures. He's never had to use force against striking workers, at least not publicized, and certainly not on any kind of large scale. In fact, he's done the opposite. He's pandered very much to Russian workers, and I'll talk about that a little bit later, of a campaign to glorify the worker in a way that we haven't seen since the Soviet period. He's even reinstituted a Soviet-era award, a national award, the highest award in the country, the Hero of Labor. It's not called socialist labor anymore, but it's still the Hero of Labor. So no, this is not an immediate parallel between Putin and Thatcher. Putin does, however, have a Thatcherite side. It was in Chechnya, the way he dealt with Chechnya. And there he showed a lack of squeamishness that was orders of magnitude greater than the Iron Ladies. So, but even if there is no real parallel, this remark, or the set of remarks by Putin yesterday about Margaret Thatcher, I believe are very important for understanding Putin, and I want to set the scene for my remarks by referring to that. The way he thinks about his legacy, his destiny. I mentioned my co-author Fiona Hill at Brookings. In November 2011, she and I were in a meeting together with Putin, as many other people too. It wasn't like we were in a private meeting with Putin. But nevertheless, we did get to ask some direct questions of him. And Fiona, right off the bat, this is November 2011. Remember, in September, that's when Putin had announced that he was going to return to the presidency. And Fiona and I were watching him and listening to him and asking questions of him, wondering, what's going on in his head. And Fiona asked him, so Mr. Putin, you've now come back and you're going to have your third term as president. This is a long time. Could you tell us what you think your legacy will be once your presidency ends? And he immediately came back with this really flippant remark, well, don't go planning my funeral just yet. And this just kind of caught everybody off guard, because what's he trying to say? Is he basically saying he's not going to leave office until he is dead and we have a funeral? What's he saying? So we speculated a lot about that, Fiona and I. We even had a long interview with each other and a transcript about that whole experience of that meeting. It's on the Brookings website. But that answer and that remark stuck with us because we didn't know it at the time, because this is November 2011, but this was right before what I would describe as the greatest political shock of Putin's career. It was just a few weeks, actually just a few days later, that the crowds in Moscow, the crowds were pouring out on the streets of Moscow, in other cities too, but far less numbers, reviling Putin publicly in unprecedented fashion. And of course, remember, they weren't protesting Putin's policies. This is not like Thatcher. They were basically protesting him, his being there, his being or wanting to be the next president again, protesting his behavior. And really, they were protesting the way he had treated them. This is what I want to, the point I want to make. And I think that this phenomenon of crowds of Russians on the streets protesting, criticizing, reviling Putin was the shock. He thought that when he would announce, he announced in September the 23rd, excuse me, that he was returning, he thought this would delight people. He really did. It's taken me a while, it took me a while to really grasp that. I'm not sure we were really fully aware of that when we met him in November, but there was something strange about his being out of touch with what we knew from conversations with Russians and from just reading the press and talking to experts. The sentiment was among a key part of the Russian population. They didn't like him. And I don't think he got that at all. And it was only later that I recalled a comment Putin had made at a press conference in June of 2011, so several months before he officially announced that he was going to return as president. He was in Stockholm, and he was at a press conference. And people were asking, as they were doing in May and June of 2011, really speculating about, was he going to come back or not? Was he going to let his designated successor, Dmitry Medvedev, continue? He'd only would have served only one term. He was eligible for the second term. But there was talk that Putin might return. So the journalist, of course, asked him the question. And Putin answered, I have made my decision. I can't tell you, I won't tell you now, he said. But when I do, you'll like it. Now, I remember, I was absolutely sure when I read the transcript and that he had said that, I was absolutely sure that this meant Medvedev was going to continue. Why else? I mean, Putin's talking to a bunch of foreign journalists in Stockholm, of all places, and telling them they'll like his decision. Of course he meant, I'm going to continue with Medvedev, right? What else? No, I was dead wrong. I was dead wrong. He really believed that the people he was talking to there, just as if he had been talking in Russia, would be delighted to know that he was going to return as president. He actually thought the whole world wanted him back. And that's how out of touch he was with Russians and with the world. And he certainly kept believing this through November. At least he was believing this when we were at that meeting I was talking about. I think he believed it until the December shock and the street demonstrations. These December protests, I believe, were the most important event in Russia since the fall of communism. And I think that they fundamentally changed the trajectory of developments in Russia. Now, understand me, it's not because these demonstrations changed opinion in Russia, public opinion in Russia. Because I'll talk a little bit later about the people who were out on the streets. There's really a small number of people. No, my point is, it changed Putin. It changed the way he thought about Russia and Russians and Russian society. And ever since then, Russia's been on a different trajectory, and I want to sort of make this my story. So I want to go back to when Putin first comes into office in 2000. You recall he was acting prime minister, then prime minister from August of 1999. And towards the end, Yeltsin, the reigning president, had made it pretty clear early on in that summer of '99 that this guy Putin you've never heard of, he's going to be the next president. Just thought I'd let you know. And that then gets built up in the press. It was not until December of '99 that Yeltsin publicly says, yes, he's my successor. In fact, I'm going to step down. I'm going to resign, and Vladimir Putin is going to be my designate as acting president, and we'll see what happens in the actual presidential election, which would be in the spring of 2000. Everybody knew that the incumbent, though simply appointed, would have the huge advantage. Putin comes in then on New Year's Day of 2000 as acting president, and he's already issued a mission statement. He's acting like the CEO of Russia Incorporated already then. He's issued a mission statement, and it's called the Millennium Message. It was actually sent out not in print but on the internet, which is pretty early for that stuff. And he makes it clear that if you want to boil down his mission to a couple of simple words, he's going to save the nation. The nation is in danger. It is on its way to facing the same fate as the Soviet Union a decade earlier. That is complete disintegration, collapse. He is going to save it. He outlines a number of ways in which he's not really specifying how he's going to do it, but sort of fleshing out the idea of what his policies would represent and how he perceived what Russians wanted and how he knew how to give it to them. Very insightful, by the way. He, in what he expressed, really was the fulfillment of almost everyone's hopes. This is what they had been waiting for. They had been suffering through a decade in which the nation was not only impoverished, it was at risk of being torn apart territorially, politically, socially. And perhaps worst of all, and I think not always appreciated, is what was really concerning, I think, Russians, was the lack of respect for Russia as a nation, for Russia as a state. And I think that if you think about it, this should be obvious. For Russians, what's primary is not welfare, prosperity, incomes, pursuit of happiness or something, or even survival. They can handle all of that. I mean, it's not to say they don't care about it. They know they can handle it. They've been through, there's nothing anybody's been through that's worse than what they've been through throughout history. They can suffer. In fact, they suffered a lot in the 1990s. It was, in fact, in the middle of the 1990s, there was maybe the extreme version of this thesis of Russian suffering that I remember. It was a book in 1995, and the title of the book was The Slave Soul of Russia, Moral Masochism and the Cult of Suffering. An amazing story, very provocative, but there's some truth to this. So, no, it wasn't poverty that was what was disturbing Russians by the end of the 1990s. There was plenty of that. It wasn't the suffering. It was the loss of dignity. People were ashamed of their country. They were ashamed of their leader, Yeltsin, who was a buffoon, a drunkard, and simply wasn't someone who they felt was in any way restoring or preserving the dignity of this great nation. And the point is that when Russians felt that Russia as a nation was worthy only of shame, then so were they as individuals. And this leads to the deal that, in effect, Putin made with the Russian population as he comes in to office in 2000. His deal was, you don't have to be ashamed of Russia. I will restore Russia's dignity. I promise that. That's my end of the bargain. Your end of the bargain, he says implicitly, is you let me decide how I accomplish my end of the bargain. You don't ask for a voice in how I run the country. This is not the time and place for that. You elected governors before, you elected local officials. That only led to disaster. These guys were bought up by whoever had the most money, by these oligarchs. They have all the power. We've got to dispense with that for a while. So Putin himself appoints governors. And in fact, Putin delivered on his promises. He very quickly forced these incredibly wealthy people, the oligarchs so-called, to pay their taxes. And given the fact that the oil price had already, even before he came into office, begun to rise from its historic lows, under $10 a barrel in 1997-98, Oil prices rise. These oligarchs who own most of the oil and gas wealth, they are earning more, and Putin has forced them now to pay taxes. So the Russian Federal Treasury is in much better shape than before. And Putin uses this money, his program to restore Russia's dignity had plank number one, step number one. We will never have dignity as a nation if we are in debt bondage to foreign debtors, and most notably to the IMF. He used the money almost, well, the overwhelming part of this money coming in to repay the debt to foreign lenders. And by 2004, the end of 2004, he inherited, well, Putin inherited about $16 billion worth of debt to the IMF. By the end of 2004, he'd paid it all off. The IMF closed up shop, more or less, and had no more say in Russia's economic, financial policy. Putin did a bunch of other things in this period. This was when he used his жесткие, ruthless methods, most ruthless methods imaginable to crush the Chechen revolt. And I can't exaggerate how bad this was. This was hundreds of thousands of people being killed as he crushed it, cities being leveled. You can think Assad in Syria times whatever. By the way, explains almost completely Putin's attitude towards Syria and Assad. My colleague Fiona has written a great article for Foreign Policy magazine making this connection. It's very clear. Putin also raised welfare for Russians. He raised incomes. One figure I like to give to illustrate this point. When he came into office as prime minister in August of 1999, the average hourly wage across the entire economy in Russia was 41 cents per hour. 41 cents per hour. By 2008, it was over $4 an hour. It was a tenfold increase. What does this mean? This meant, I mean, this is just the average. It meant that there was an incredibly large, in absolute numbers, number of Russians who were now not just getting by, they were actually pretty prosperous. They were pretty well off. They had, above all, a lot of disposable income, and they had a huge pent-up demand to use that income to spend on consumer goods. The retail market in Russia boomed. It was the hottest market in the world. And there are all kinds of statistics about how more high-end BMWs and Mercedes were being sold in Moscow than any other entire country in the world, et cetera, et cetera. Retailers flocked to Moscow, IKEA stores, restaurants, not just Moscow, but mainly Moscow. Foreign retailers were flooding Russia with goods, but also at the same time, Russians were flooding Europe as tourists and as they spent their money. These were shopping tours, not least. They were heading out, buying European goods in Europe, and then increasingly able to buy European goods inside of Russia. But this flood of tourism, this interaction on the consumer level with the rest of the world, and in particular with Western Europe, is absolutely key, because Russians began now to really think of themselves as equals with the rest of Europe, with Europeans, as individuals. At least those, of course, not all Russians, but those who were able to consume and travel in this way that I'm describing. This was the new middle class, and this became a very popular topic of discussion about the emerging middle class and what it would mean for Russia's future. So it was a reality. Now, so what about then that original deal, if you like, that Putin had with Russia and Russians as a whole? The deal, remember, was I restore the dignity of the nation. You just let me do it and don't ask for a voice in politics. in policy making. Well, Putin had fulfilled his part of the bargain. That's the way people perceived it. He really had restored the dignity of the nation. And you could talk to Russians and they would say that quite literally. And Russians felt good about that. They were no longer ashamed. They were actually quite proud, not only of their country, but even of their leader. Here's this young guy. He doesn't drink. He's fit. He's in great shape. All this seemed good. All this seemed great. And they themselves personally were well off now, as I said. But there was something missing, because it was as if, okay, you did what you said you were going to do. That's great. Now, maybe it's time to revise this deal. Maybe it's time for us to stop being treated as children, or that we no longer are simply taken for granted. Can't we also have a voice? I mean, that was implicitly what's going on here. And at first, it looked like that was exactly what was happening. There was a revision of the deal. Remember, 2007, in the fall of 2007, there's talk about maybe a new president. And in December, I guess it was, Putin announces that his good young friend and associate colleague, Dmitry Medvedev, would be his choice for president of Russia. Amazing. Now something new is happening. And this guy Medvedev looks different, acts different, talks different, has different kind of people around him. This does look like, indeed, a revision of the deal. Now it's time to move beyond the very paternalistic approach that Putin had initially had, for good reason, because now I had to do the tough measures. Now we can start to relax a little bit, and we can start to act more normal, and that means a more normal political situation. This is beginning of 2008, remember? Medvedev is elected handily. It just looks so good. It's late spring of 2008, beginning of the summer of 2008. Oil prices, it's amazing. They just continued to go up. By late June, early July, world oil prices are over $140, $146 a barrel one day. Remember where they started, under $10 a barrel when Russia was in its worst situation in the crisis. And around Medvedev, he's talking about all kinds of progressive ideas. He's got some energetic young people around him. People were skeptical. Some were cynical. Of course, Putin is still in power. We don't deny that. But look, he's giving us more space. He's letting us take more responsibility. And we'll do it through Medvedev. Many, many Russian intellectuals, the so-called elites, look to Medvedev in that way. They weren't naive. They didn't think Medvedev was going to seize power from Putin. They saw it all part of a more evolutionary, gradual process that was very, very positive. The new middle class was getting its voice, was getting its political platform and a representative. But it was not long after that, that means it's not long after the whole thing started, that it began to slow down and began to change. Because it was in late July 2008 when the world financial crisis hits with a vengeance. Oil prices begin to plummet. Stock markets globally begin to plummet, and Russia's in particular, because it's so tightly correlated with the price of oil. The Russian stock market, within a matter of weeks, a few months, loses 80% of its value. So 80% of all the wealth is just suddenly gone. And it was clear that Putin no longer is taking this whole idea of Dmitry Medvedev as his co-regent very seriously. Medvedev is being undercut, and this feeling and this trend continues throughout 2009 and 2010. By 2011, there's a real feeling of unease, even late 2010, across the board by these very people, this elite, these intellectuals, this vocal part or more active part of the middle class, if you like, are feeling uneasy. This is not going well. It's only beginning. It's undefined feelings, but it's begun to grow. And as I indicated earlier, by the spring of 2011, as people begin to think forward to the next president's term, is Putin going to return? What's going to happen? A lot of speculation that the whole experiment with Medvedev is probably over. We don't know what's going to happen. And then, on September the 23rd, Putin just up and announces, I've decided, or he actually said we've decided, but sort of nobody had any illusions by that anymore, that I'm gonna be the next president. He didn't even pay lip service. He didn't even orchestrate this. It would be one thing if it were some sort of phony orchestrated, oh, we're all, you know, people decided they want him back, or give him motivation for why he's doing this. Not even that, not even lip service. It was just simple pronouncement. I've decided it's going to happen. And after that, I mean, I think that just, there were things sort of seething below the surface. There was that uneasiness, I know, that was there all the time, people wondering what's going to happen. I think this just blew the lid off of a lot of latent, repressed dissatisfaction, even hatred of Putin from all kinds of people. And here is the important thing. It was not any longer just this vocal, so-called, as the Russians like to say, the active part of society that was expressing their dislike of Putin. It was everywhere. And I can testify to that because in the most bizarre sort of way possible, I was there, as I said, for this in Moscow in November of 2011, the time that Fiona and I met with Putin. But I had a few days before that program started. So I met, among other things, with a Russian friend of mine who's a really rich guy. He's not an oligarch. I mean, he doesn't even come close to being an oligarch. To be an oligarch, you've got to have billions. He had millions. But he was some kind of multimillionaire for sure. I mean, I remember he has hanging in his bedroom in his dacha, not even in his real house, but in his dacha, he had a painting that was worth, that he bought for $500,000. So I don't know what else he's got. But he also was an honest, I mean, I don't know how honest, you know, nobody can be totally honest in Russia, but he was a genuine, let me put it this way, a genuine entrepreneur and industrialist. This much I know for sure. He had truly started businesses. He had invested the money he earned in the initial businesses in founding new factories, building new factories. He was very interested in real production. He had a background as a scientist from the old Soviet days, and he was serious in this regard, dead serious. And but again, very rich man, one of the real business elites of Russia. And he picks me up at the airport in his limousine car there, and the driver, he turns to me and he said, "Yeah, Cliff, I got to tell you, this is November. The elections for the Russian parliament, the Duma, are going to take place in December." He says, I've decided I'm going to vote for the communist. I said, okay, I get it. A lot of people are unhappy with Putin, and you got to tell me about that, but are you kidding me? You're going to vote for the communist? You know what you're saying? And you know what you're doing? And he gives me this long explanation about how the communists aren't so bad. Zyuganov, the head of the Communist Party, he's an old guy, but he has some young people that my friend Misha's claimed were, you know, well-informed economically, and which they weren't. But anyway, he was going to vote for the communists, and he told me the reason was that corruption had reached such a limit he couldn't tolerate it anymore. But that doesn't really capture what he's saying. Corruption can mean anything to a lot of different people. He meant specifically the level of kickbacks that he had to pay for every single contract, every single business deal he did was exorbitant, and it had been rising, and it was now, simply too much. He couldn't put up with it anymore. It was going to drive him out of business. So to save his existence as a capitalist, as a multimillionaire, he was prepared to vote for the communists. So I'm just saying, this is the kind of stuff that's going on at Russia at this time. You know, things at that point have shifted. So I knew, man, something's going on here. I just didn't know how much, because none of us really, at least nobody that I know, could predict that we would have demonstrations, protest demonstrations of tens of thousands of people out on the streets of Moscow within a few days, triggered by the blatant vote fraud in the Duma election, just brazen, blatant fraud. And it was, so it's, again, it's not that there was vote fraud. It's like everybody expects that we vote fraud. But you don't even try to hide it. It's, again, to me, it's as much about the way people are being treated, taken for granted, as it is about the actual behavior, actually what's happening to them. And I think that this is exactly what people were reacting against. Now, of course, we read that this was the democracy movement. This was the real, these were the good guys, the white ribbon people, and the West, and especially the Western media, was euphoric about all of this. We were very much caught up in the idea that this was the end of Putin. I have on my wall in my office, I have the Economist magazine cover, the beginning of the end of Putin, right? This was pretty much the general sentiment, and a lot of analysis about how this all stuff was going to spread throughout the country. So let me just say a word about this, the opposition, about the white ribboned people. There was much discussion about that this was the new Russia, trying to link this to the emergence of the new middle class that I described, correlated with the growth in wealth. There was also a more interesting and more perceptive, but not a very big discussion, that no, it's something more than that. This is not just about economics or about income levels. There's something special about these people in Moscow that are the most vocal, that are really leading these demonstrations. And someone pointed out that the type of people out there, they're very much like Richard Florida, the American, I think Richard is a sociologist, I'm not sure. Actually, he used to be Brookings briefly, but in any event, he's the author of the book from several years ago, from I guess 10 years ago, called The Rise of the New Creative Class. The Rise of the New Creative Class, coining this term, the creative class. I won't go into his theories. I'm sure most of you, or many of you, are very familiar with that. The idea that it's not any longer about income levels necessarily, but it's about the type of jobs people have. And his definition of creative class was far broader than merely writers or actors or actresses or musicians, but it included anyone who actually thinks independently and really does create. It could be hairdressers. It could be certainly people who work in the clothing industry, but many, many parts of our economy in which the real value of the enterprise or the firm or whoever it is that's employing them is in these people's creativity, their talent, their ability to think innovatively and independently, and that's exactly, you know, what we're looking at here. Obviously, mostly younger generation people, but not exclusively. And indeed, this is true. I mean, my point was that there were some people talking about this as a key element of this new protest, this new movement. But it is very important to understand that two things. One, all of the people who were demonstrating and out there actively protesting still constituted a very tiny fraction of the total Russian electorate. Secondly, the people out there demonstrating and protesting were by no means only this group that I've been describing, the creative class, people who were very strongly, I think, in favor of, as Richard Florida outlines, these are people who are very, very strong advocates of freedom, of individual freedom, of human rights, of democracy, and above all, this is Rick's single most important attribute of the creative class, tolerance. Tolerance. That one concept distinguishes them from everything else and kind of characterizes this view. And I would say that's not bad description of this very important segment of the Russian opposition to Putin. But within the overall scope of the demonstrators, we don't know the exact proportions and figures, but they clearly were not in the majority. And there was, in fact, a coalition of 3 different groups, very different trends or currents in Russian politics and society. So one part are these people who are clearly liberals, both politically and economically in the European sense of economic. And that produces this weird phenomenon that doesn't work in the US, because the European liberal is usually the economic, basically a Tea Party type, right? I mean, or a libertarian almost, in that direction. Staunch advocates of the free market and also of very responsible, balanced budget fiscal policies. At least that's what they were in Russia. They were strong advocates of a free market, but also of tight-fisted government spending policies. But they're also definitely, for the most part, people who advocated respect for human rights and proponents of democracy. So that's the one group. The other, second group, are the leftists. These are every single variety of communist you can imagine, from the traditional successors of the Soviet communists, all kinds of new and other varieties of leftist, communist, Trotskyist, you name it. And older people, but not only. There were a bunch of young people among them, and that's growing in Russia. And the third group were the nationalists, and some pretty hardcore nationalists at that. And what I mean by nationalists is I mean racist and, you know, really the kinds of extremists that you see in the skinhead movement and things like that. There were groups among the opposition coalition that were of that stripe. But Putin, I believe, and his people around him, they had to deal with all 3 of these currents, and there's a whole story about how they try individually to manipulate them. Just as an aside, I can say that it is ironic, because what's the traditional tried and true method to undermine an opposition movement like this? If you want, it's divide and conquer, right? Divide and conquer. And it would seem that there's hardly anything simpler than divide this 3 currents that are so much at odds with each other. If you look at their ideologies and their goals and their attitudes, it would be pretty easy to divide them. And yet, splitting up that coalition would be one of the most dangerous things imaginable for Putin. Why? Because as long as they stay in a coalition, they have to compromise with each other. Each one of these has to tone down the message. If they were to split up, there would be no such constraints on their behavior, political behavior, and you would get some real extremist movements. And why would that be so dangerous to Putin? 2 reasons. One, he doesn't like extremists of any kind. He is very, very nervous about anything that can divide and split Russian society. It's not by accident, as the Russians would say, that the name of his political party is United Russia, except that's a mistranslation. It's hard to translate. Единая Россия doesn't really mean United Russia. That's not the word you use when you talk about the United Nations or the United States or even the United Kingdom. There are 2 other words for that. No, единая means one, single, the soul, just single Russia. And that's what Putin is not thinking about his Russia as being united in some kind of melting pot sort of story. No, we're all Russians. There's one Russia. There's one kind of Russians. And it's not ethnic Russians. I mean, he's not saying that this means you exclude those from Muslims, Jews, or whatever. No, it's just that there's something Russian that supersedes all of that other stuff. And we have to make sure that we, Russia, stay as one Russia. So he doesn't like extremism. He doesn't like any kinds of separatism or thing that would tear Russia apart. So that's one main reason why he would, in principle, be opposed to a policy or a tactic, I guess, that would split this opposition, even though it would, in theory, weaken them as a movement. But the other reason is that liberals, economic liberals especially, leftists, populist kind of things, and nationalists, wow, that's his coalition. That's exactly what his base is in all three of those areas. He has a base among the liberal economic forces. They brought him to power, by the way, those same people, the Gaidars, the Chubaises, and the Kudrans, and he has followed their policies in the economic sphere pretty persistently. The populism, this was one of the things he said. This is part of the Russian soul. It's collectivism, solidarity. This notion of sharing. There's an element of leftist ideology that is an important part of his. And he had a strong base among certain parts of those who had previously been pretty committed communist, pro-Soviet communist type people. And thirdly, the nationalists. Well, Putin he's all about the pride of the state of Russia as a nation, Russia's mission in the world, its civilizing mission, he refers to it, not an imperial mission, but Russia as a grand historic civilization that deserves to have its a strong voice in everything to do in the world, pride in the nation, extreme patriotism, verging very closely onto forms of nationalism. And so, turned loose, untethered, these three currents that made up the opposition and allowed, being untethered, not having to compromise with each other, allowed to really preach a pure form of what they were advocating, would be exactly the kind of political currents that could pull away the people from his base. Because his problem has always been keeping all of these disparate groups together and keeping them all happy. And in every single case, there is dissatisfaction in his own base because they think he's not really living up to what he kind of promised to us. The liberals say that. He's not enough of a free market guy. He's not liberal enough. He's not this enough. The leftists are saying he's not enough of a leftist. And the nationalists, he's not enough of a nationalist. So, his whole base would be threatened by that. Now, so what happened? I'm almost to the end of my talk, so let me just quickly give you the bottom line of this. The presidential election in the spring of 2012, Putin wins handily. But during the campaign, some interesting things happen. And I think this is where the real shift becomes noticeable. The real conclusions he drew from the shock of December and the December protest. There was a TV hotline show. Putin's talking to the nation. Millions of people are watching on TV, listening, or whatever, online. And the format, which has been going on year after year, is that people from different parts of the country would be allowed to ask questions and introduce themselves. It's all staged, it's all orchestrated in detail. But how they do it is important. Well, sure enough, a call comes in from a city out in the middle of the Urals Mountains, this big rust belt of Russia, from a city called Nizhny Tagil. And they're at a plant that has the official name of the Urals rail car manufacturing plant, Uralvagonzavod. Except, of course, Well, they do produce rail cars there. They produce a lot of rail cars there. But what they really produced there, especially historically, were those big, massive Soviet tanks. This was the biggest tank producer in the world. This was the biggest factory in the world, literally, without comparison. It was physically the biggest factory in the world, and even the Pentagon wrote about it in the 1990s in their heyday of the Cold War. It's the flagship of the Russian defense industry. It's the epitome of the Soviet-style Russian worker. And so Igor is the worker's name, who says, I have a question, or really just a comment, Mr. Putin. Totally support you. Me and all the guys here, we're going to vote for you. And by the way, we were talking, we've been watching on TV all these demonstrations. It doesn't really look like your police in Moscow are able to handle this very well. And we just thought we'd let you know, if you can't do it, we're willing to, me and the boys will come to Moscow and we'll take care of the problem for you. And that was pretty much the language he used. And Putin sort of, thank you, Igor, for that offer. But right now, I don't need it. I don't need this. Right now. And the implicit was, yeah, maybe later, but now, no. So this intimidation factor is clearly there. After the election, this guy, Igor, who was at that time a total unknown, he was like a shop foreman in this tank plant, he gets appointed to be one of the top political figures in all of Russia. He gets to be the presidential plenipotentiary for the entire Urals region. I mean, it's pretty amazing. So this begins, or this symbolizes, because it didn't begin, but this symbolizes a real shift where Putin has clearly decided that this creative class bunch in Moscow, and it is centered in Moscow. Moscow is my problem. He can see this in the voting results, in the election results, both from the Duma and even from the presidential vote. You begin to disaggregate the votes and look what's happening here, and you see this is a serious problem, and it's starting to spread to other large cities. It's like an infection that has to be contained. And at that point, Putin launches something that is almost like a military campaign. He begins to take all kinds of measures to downgrade emphasis on Moscow, to somehow contain Moscow, and more importantly, to pump money, effort, propaganda into the regions of Russia, to the outlying regions, and especially these large industrial cities, culminating in an announcement that over the next 10 years, he would spend $750 billion worth of money on the defense industrial complex. You cannot appreciate how radical and revolutionary this is. It's often not noticed that for some 10 years, Putin spent almost nothing on the Russian military. He was spending the money on paying off the debt, not building up the military. This is a shift, and it's interpreted by people in my city of Washington, by people, oh God, Russia's going to rearm and they're going to be a big threat. It has nothing to do with Russia trying to be a serious military threat. This is all about a political move to bolster his base, to create something, he hopes, that could be a political counterweight to the growing creative class in Moscow. And he has literally used the term that this will be my new creative class. And this will be the scientists and the doctors and the school teachers and the skilled workers. And oh my God, it's beginning to sound just like the Soviet Union, because this was, the elites of the Soviet Union. So what he's done is made an explicit and very well thought out policy of bolstering this part of Russian society in opposition to this creative class. And because of Russia's structure, it's turned also into a kind of a geographical, regional division. What he needs to do is, in his mind, make sure that the attractiveness of his middle class is greater than the attractiveness of Moscow and that other middle class. He has to prevent the youth, the young people, the new generation, from doing what they've been doing, what they probably all want to do, which is leave some of these really remote and cold places and get into Moscow where the action is. He spent money on doing this with a network of regional universities. I've been to some of them. The idea is that the money that under Medvedev was being allocated to create a new Silicon Valley-like arrangement outside of Moscow, getting in top scientists, including some international scientists, and kind of a pie-in-the-sky idea of replicating Silicon Valley. But nevertheless, with a lot of international input, will now be translated into getting those same scientists finding that the only money they can get, you're welcome to work on these new innovative high-tech projects, nanotech, and you name it, but now your client, your customer will be the Russian defense industrial complex, and so you will be also tied to this and to win back this. Now, to conclude, is this going to work? I mean, basically Putin thinks he won the first round. There was a battle. Yes, they came out on the streets. Yes, the creative class came out against me. We had a battle, but I won. Contrary to what all the international media was hoping and saying and predicting, I won. He says Russians as a whole don't want this. They're afraid of revolution. He played up this angle, which is true. They want stability. So now he thinks it's time to consolidate. He has seen this in the past months. It's time to consolidate his victory and strengthen his base. He's even offered some kind of offers to co-opt part of the opposition. It's almost like a one-time offer. I think the offer has expired now, but it was a brief period when he more or less said, okay, let's let bygones be bygones. Okay, if you want to work constructively for a common purpose, for a strong Russia, you're welcome to do it. I don't hold anything against you. Come on and join us. Come on and join the common effort. Implicit in that, by the way, being that if you don't take my offer, you have just now identified yourselves as traitors, as anti-Russians, as working with the opposition. And I think you know most of the rest of the story, that this repression is still very selective. There's by no means some kind of police state we're talking about. It's very selective, but it's also carefully targeted. And as you know, it's targeting NGOs that have any possible foreign connection, foreign funding. A lot of it is sending the message, sending the signals, the intimidation. And my prediction is that he will try to stick to this same method. He will select out a few individuals. There's one figure, Navalny, who's really important and very popular and kind of charismatic. That guy probably will end up where Khodorkovsky is, Mikhail Khodorkovsky. He'll end up somewhere in some camp. But it's not likely that anytime soon we're going to see any sort of blanket repression or, as I say, classic Soviet-style police state methods. The idea that Putin has is exactly what he was referring to in the case of Margaret Thatcher. Sometimes in a crisis, you got to be tough, you got to be ruthless. It's for the greater good. This won't last forever. You just can't be squeamish. You just got to take the measures that are necessary when they are necessary. And history will vindicate you, because you will have, by doing that, by not backing down, by not being soft, you will not have betrayed the nation. You will, in fact, have saved the nation. We'll see what history says about whether he can even be successful in the medium term with this. He is in the short term. And we'll certainly, some of us maybe will be around long enough to see what history says about Vladimir Putin as a leader. He'll go down in history, I'm quite sure of that. It's a big mistake to think that this is a nobody, a faceless man who doesn't matter. He matters a lot. He's an important figure. But exactly what his legacy will be, Fiona's question, my colleague's question remains, you know. What does he think his legacy will be? When will he begin to carefully assess the realism of his own strategy? But right now he's caught in a dilemma. He knows that for Russia to be great, for Russia to survive, it's not military competition, it's economic competition. You have to be a strong, vibrant, dynamic, developing economy. You can't be that in today's world unless you have people, individuals, who are innovative, independent, creative. He needs the creative class. That's the key to his whole success. And yet they hate him, and he can't tolerate them, and he's trying to suppress them. That just does not work in the long run. So the question really is not whether it will work in the long run. The question is, how long will it work in the short run, and what consequences will be if this reaches pressure cooker force and just blows open. The political struggle, I think the future of Russia is politics, not economics, even though I'm an economist, and I think we got to keep our eyes closely on it because the whole story is by no means over. Thank you very much.